My name is Rob Gilbert and I'm the Director of the Calleva Centre here at Magdalen College, and you're very welcome to this Calleva seminar which Julia Ebner is going to give for us. As some of you will know, Julia is a postdoctoral research associate with our Calleva Centre here in Oxford, in Magdalen College, but she's also a lab leader at the Oxford Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion and a senior research fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, as well as her academic degrees, which are from the London School of Economics and from Peking University, and then a DPhil from Oxford. She has published 3 books, I think, already, and so it's going to be great to hear from Julia about her work, which is associated, I guess, looking towards the work you're going to do on the project, which is, as you know, around how despots or would-be despots are giving themselves away or not by the language they're using. So over to you, Julia, and thank you for being here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for the kind introduction, Rob. As Rob mentioned, I will talk about radicalization and violent extremism and approach the topic from different angles. So I will first talk about drivers and trends in radicalization, but I will then also go a little bit into solutions. And so the main part of the presentation will be focused on both my work, the work that I did as part of my academic projects here in Oxford, but also some of it will be drawing on the research that I did for my book projects, which were done in a personal capacity. And I will then, in the very end, also give an outlook of what my current project at the Calleva Centre is about and what it will be, what the aims and the methods are for this project. So let me first start by giving an overview of the current trends or emerging trends in radicalization. There are several trends that we can identify, and I've done this kind of research for the last 10 years now. So I will give you mainly insights based on these last 10 years and the trends and developments we could witness in the last decade. Here are the 3 books that I published in those last few years. I published my first book in 2018, which was about the reciprocal radicalization effect. So the interplay between far-right and Islamist extremism. When you think back about ISIS, and when ISIS was at the height of their power and launched a lot of jihadist attacks across Europe and the US and also the UK, there was a backlash from far-right extremists who then could use anti-Muslim resentment to fuel hate against minorities and to really recruit more people into their camps. And then vice versa, of course, Islamist extremists and especially jihadist organizations like ISIS could then also use this growing anti-Muslim resentment and the growing hate towards them to recruit more members from alienated Muslim communities. So it was really about that reciprocal radicalization effect. The second book was published in 2020 and was about the secret social lives of extremists. It was basically an ethnographic study of extremists, online but also offline. So I did probably cross some of the borders of what would be acceptable in terms of ethical frameworks within university standards. It was more investigative journalistic in its approach, because I also joined some of these extremist groups in their online chat rooms and even in some of their offline meetings. And then the last book, going mainstream, was the continuation of that research, was showing how some of these very extreme fringe ideas have now actually slowly been penetrating more mainstream discourse and even politics. So I will be showing some examples from these books, which you will recognize them because they're a bit more vivid, more case study based, whereas my academic research, you will also recognize it will be more drawing on statistical analysis, on natural language processing, linguistic analysis and quantitative analysis. But I want to combine the both because it gives a good idea of what is happening and why it's happening. So the first trend that we could really see take shape in the last few years, I would say already in the last decade, is the gamification of recruitment and propaganda among extremist groups. Of course, ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State, really pioneered some of these gamified recruitment tactics because they wanted to reach the youngest generations. They wanted to reach Generation Z. So they thought very carefully about how to make their propaganda most visually appealing, but also tap into some of the hobby communities and online subcultures. So, for example, it's quite ironic actually, because although they despise Western culture, despise Hollywood, of course, and also the gaming, these Western video games, they used a lot of video game references in their own propaganda. So on the left-hand side here, you can see one of their posters or one of their propaganda visuals that they used, which used the graphics of the video game Call of Duty and turned it into Call of Jihad. And they put a jihadist on kind of top of that video game to suggest that if you join the battle for Islamic State, you will become the protagonist or the hero of your own video game, which is, of course, a huge euphemism and was the darker side of what it meant to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria was, of course, much darker than this. And far-right extremists have copied some of these tactics, and you can even see in their visuals that they have actually imitated some of what ISIS did because they saw how appealing it was and how successful it was with young audiences. So, for example, these are graphics that the international alt-right used in their recruitment campaigns. So they used, for example, the video game God of War and turned it into God of Race War, and copy-pasted the head of the Italian terrorist Luca Traini onto its front. One of the current examples of this is the UK-based organization Patriotic Alternative, which is a white nationalist organization that has unfortunately been very successful in recruiting minors and very young members into its networks. The head of this organization is Mark Collette, and I've actually interviewed him for one of my books and did a word association game, played a word association game with him. And his idea is that is based on the Great Replacement conspiracy myth, based on the idea that gradually Europeans are being erased by non-white populations, and this is all an effort that is orchestrated by the so-called global elite. So this is the conspiracy myth that Patriotic Alternative is spreading. And they have used, for example, video game tournaments to lure in young members and especially teenagers who then wrote into the chat function of this video game, "I have my bedtime approaching soon, I have to go to school tomorrow." And in the same line, they would say, "Hail Hitler," or would use some very strong neo-Nazi language. So it was very clear that this was an effective tool for at least luring in some very young members into their networks. A second case that can be used that is even more recent is the developing culture among so-called alt-Salafists. So it's jihadist networks that have been inspired by these tactics used by the alt-right and that have even adopted some of the language and some of the memes, for example, that the alt-right pioneered. So, for example, Pepper the Frog has now also become something that is a point of reference for these Salafi jihadi networks, which is interesting because there's this cross-pollination between these different forms of extremism. A second trend that we could identify in the last decade or so is a stronger tendency to really create very effective international networks and even have international collaboration between extremists, both on the jihadist side but also in other ideological extremist camps. So, of course, also among neo-Nazis, this is an example from the neo-Nazi website Iron March, where actually if you look at the coordinates of the users, you see that they're spread out across the globe. And because of social media and also because of some of the encrypted chat applications like Telegram and like some of these forums as well, they have really brought together like-minded individuals and have created an effect where they are networking a lot more than they used to. And where you also see that groups such as National Action, which is a proscribed white nationalist terror group in the UK, where they have created international networks. And what surprised me most in this research was that actually even some of the most traditionally minded neo-Nazis that used to be very much locally rooted in their own region and very hierarchically structured, that they have now branched out and kind of engaged in what I would call transnational ultranationalism. So they're now, it's a paradox in itself, because they are now internationally collaborating, although they of course campaign for ultranationalist causes. And the neo-Nazi scene in Germany is a good example of this. So I went to one of the big neo-Nazi festivals at the German-Polish border a few years ago, and I witnessed myself how international this festival has become. So there were people who were coming together there based on mutual hobbies. So, for example, the mixed martial arts, but also the hard rock and heavy metal music scene has really created a network online where they meet in the same YouTube channels, or they watch the same mixed martial arts videos, or they order the same fashion, which is a kind of mix of Nazi and hipster fashion, which is called nipster fashion. And so that is often a point where they actually come together. And this has, of course, strengthened, in some of the cases, strengthened their networks and also the way in which they can amplify their narratives, not just in their own country, but they can make use of social media and talk to people, like-minded people on the other side of the world. Another case study would be ISIS, where, especially since the fall of the territory in Syria and Iraq, there has been a shift towards more towards a focus on the so-called cyber caliphate. So we have different cells emerging in different countries, and the communication is really global. I was in some of the chat groups used by jihadi brides, or also by, for example, an ISIS hacking group that was set up to teach its members how to perform low-skill hacking, for example, hack into a website or hack a small-scale infrastructure. And those groups were all very international. So you had some people from Germany, from the US, from Pakistan, and you could really see how they were trying to create this what they call united cyber caliphate online. And the third trend, before I go to the next, to basically the next part of the presentation, the third trend is an emerging alternative tech ecosystem. This has already also been evolving over the past, I would say, 5 to 7 years, where there are alternatives to the mainstream social media platforms, to the types of Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. There are alternatives that have been set up under the banner of unlimited free speech, but that have been hijacked or, in some cases, co-opted by extremists for their own purposes. And some of them have also been explicitly set up with extremist purposes. So, for example, there are alternative social media websites, but also crowdsourcing websites that really are used to gather resources or collect money for hate campaigns or even for acts of violence. There are even alternative dating websites, which are very disturbing places because you come across lots of neo-Nazi profiles, for example. And there's this entire alternative ecosystem that lies beyond the mainstream social media platforms. And often we see that actually the way that extremist campaigns are spreading is that they start in these more closed forums and in these closed alternative safe havens for extremists, and then they are spread over the more mainstream ecosystem to reach wider audiences. So first you would see platforms like BitChute, for example, is an alternative to YouTube. It's used by mainly far-right extremists and conspiracy theorists. Odyssey is very similar. Getter and Gab are also alternatives to Facebook or to kind of social media platforms. And then you also have the encrypted messaging platforms like, for example, Discord or Telegram or similar apps that are used for internal communication and coordination. And then you only see these campaigns coming onto the bigger platforms. And actually that's where they try to recruit new members or reach new audiences. And of course, the recent takeover of Twitter by Elon Musk, which is now of course called X, has also played a role because now X has also become more of a hotspot for some of these campaigns. A case study for this is what was at the time Europe's biggest neo-Nazi trolling army, Reconquista Germanica. It was a German initially a German Discord group. Discord is a gaming, an internal gaming chat application. And there were over 10,000 members that joined this trolling army. And their goal was to influence the run-up to the German elections. So they really wanted to have an influence on the online discourse, but potentially also influence the outcome of the elections. And they coordinated everything they did behind the scenes and on Discord, and had very gamified methods as well, by the way. So they used a manual for guerrilla warfare tactics, which was linked to the Generation Identity movement, or members of the Generation Identity movement had created this manual. And they wanted to be most effective in their information warfare. And they used very military, very much militarized language to carry out these online campaigns. And you can even see, one more. Oh. What's happening now? Sorry, I think I pressed the wrong, no, okay, it's here again. You can see here on the left-hand side that they actually had military-like hierarchies where you could reach different ranks in the trolling army. So there was also an incentive, a gamified incentive, to reach these higher ranks by performing particularly well in some of these targeted hate campaigns. And sometimes they actually were directed against politicians, sometimes against journalists, or sometimes against anyone who would oppose their own views or their own ideas. The first threat that emerges from these trends is, of course, terrorism related to terror and violence. And here we have several different, I would say, categories of how this can play out. So one of the more recent trends in this, what I would say is the bigger category of terror and violence, is the doxing and hacking of politicians, and, as I said, of political opponents, could also be activists, journalists, where doxing actually means the leaking of personal details on the internet. And that, in combination with threat campaigns, where actually more and more journalists and politicians have been receiving death threats. There are several studies, one done by the University of Oslo, their CREC center, just recently, that showed that it's that really high numbers of politicians, at least in Norway, and that's just one example, one study that has been done, have been receiving death threats, have been receiving violent threats on their social media accounts or even to their private email addresses. And there are also some other surveys that suggest that, for example, especially female journalists, but also journalists with minority backgrounds, have been most prone to these types of threat campaigns. And this is sometimes also combined with house visits, where extremists have increasingly even visited journalists or politicians at their homes to intimidate them, to silence them. So this is, of course, one way of terrorizing in the wider sense of terror, of terrorizing political opponents. But then, of course, you also have a whole separate category of actual violence, of really acts of terrorism that have accelerated in the spectrum of far-right extremists recently, where initially when I started this kind of work, I looked mainly at jihadist acts of violence. I looked at ISIS attacks, I looked at Al-Qaeda attacks, and now increasingly my focus has also shifted towards neo-Nazi or white supremacist attacks, because they've become more and more common, especially in Europe and also in the UK, the US and Australia. And this is an example of Brenton Tarrant, the attacker who was behind the 2019 shootings that happened at 2 mosques in Christchurch, which killed 52 Muslims. These attacks were carried out with a strong gamification element. So the attacker live streamed his attack with a GoPro, and from an ego shooter angle, so a bit like you're playing a video game and it's shot from this perspective. And he also used a lot of gaming references in his manifesto that he left behind, and also in the live stream itself. And this was, of course, part of his idea to spread his extremist views, but also B, the tactic of gamification of terrorism. And this was quite successful, because it essentially was blurring the lines between trolling and terrorism. And the initial reactions, I was online when the attack unfolded, or as we heard of the attack unfolding, I immediately went online and I saw that the first comment underneath the live stream was from an anonymous user who was saying, "This is a LARP, isn't it? This is a live action role play." So they could not really grasp that this was a real world act of violence. They were not sure whether this was just a simulation or some form of game, or whether this was real. And this is, in general, a dynamic that we've been observing over the last few years. Other people who've been monitoring kind of the evolution of terrorist attacks, that there is a strong competition for high scores among these attackers, and even among the audiences that they are trying to cater to. So in some of these online forums that were discussing the attacks, that were sympathetic towards the Christchurch shooters' causes, there was a call to top his score. And by score, of course, they mean the number of victims, the number of people killed. So there was this gamification of terrorism, where they were competing for higher scores. And this inspired then also a few months later the attacker in Germany, in Halle, to conduct a very similar attack, which was also live streamed, or where he meant to live stream it, and also left behind a manifesto that even had a list of achievements basically when he would use a certain method to kill someone or strike a certain target, that he would get a certain number of points, a bit like in a video game. So this was a very terrifying, or is a very terrifying trend that is, of course, still evolving as well. I do hope if anyone finds these images or what I'm saying too distressing, please do let me know, and I'm happy to jump over the slide. Or also, if there are any questions for clarification, feel free to ask in between. Another trend related to the use of violence, and especially to terrorism, is DIY, do-it-yourself terrorism, where a lot of the terrorists recently have made use of new technologies such as 3D printers to print their own weapons. This is something that in gaming is called weapons crafting. So they've actually made use of also this gaming component of creating their own weapons. And of course, it's also for them been useful to circumvent any kind of monitoring, potential monitoring from the security forces, because you leave fewer traces if you don't engage in weapons smuggling, for example. So unfortunately, it's also made it easier for extremists to assemble their own weapons. And then also ideological and tactical inspiration in the form of copycat attacks, where inspirational terrorism has become an emerging trend, where actually some of the attackers have quoted previous attackers' manifestos, have even written their names on their own weapons, and have been very strongly inspired even by for example, instructions on how to produce your own weapons, or on how to create your own explosives that have been left behind by previous attackers, where the security services are constantly in a race against time to remove these. The tech platforms as well, Google, for example, they are removing these instruction manuals, but nonetheless, there's still, every day, there are new ones that are being uploaded that would give very clear instructions on how to build these weapons. So it's a constant race against time. What can we do about this? So in terms of prevention, there are of course several angles, but I want to dive into one in particular, which was based on my doctoral project here in Oxford. The biggest question for me at the beginning of this project was, how can we identify the people who actually engage in forms of violence, in forms of extreme violence like terrorism, from the people who are just trolling, or who might just use empty words but never take action. And I came across Harvey Whitehouse's research on identity fusion, and this was what inspired me to do this project, previously to now doing a project here at the Calleva Center at Modeling College. But this project, the initial idea or the research aim of it was to find better ways of informing predictive models that can tap into the deeper psychological motivations and spot them in language that terrorists use or that violent extremists use, who actually engage in violence, rather than just threatening violence, but never resorting to any real action. So, so the question was, on the one hand, it was about filling an academic gap. There have, of course, been a lot of studies that have tried to improve detection mechanisms, that have done linguistic analysis of violent extremist texts, especially of their propaganda. But there has been very little research that was actually rooted in theory. And I'll go to this in a second. But the second aim was also a very practical aim, to help security services and intelligence agencies to improve and also to complement some of their existing threat detection systems. Of course, the agencies do have their own detection systems that are already in place. There were quite a lot of ethical considerations that I was, of course, going through very carefully. So I did the CUREC 2 application and ensured that all data sets would be confidential, would be strictly confidential, and would also be anonymized, so to protect the privacy of any of the users that are included in the analysis. And I also, of course, made sure to forward anything of real relevance in terms of immediate threat to the relevant security services. But if you have any questions about the ethical questions or how I tackled these questions, we can also discuss it later in the Q&A. And so the theoretical background for this study, as I said, came from the field of evolutionary anthropology and social psychology, where Harvey Whitehouse has spearheaded some of the key research and the key studies conducted in this field, where different forms of group alignment can be tied to different outcomes in terms of behavior. So very often I noticed that the terrorism and even conflict literature spoke about only about one of these types, which was group identification, identifying very strongly with an in-group, and tied that to violent action. But actually the theory and a lot of the evidence that has been shown in studies across the last few decades shows that actually group identification is more strongly associated with ideological fixation on the group's norms and belief systems. So whether they are extreme or non-extreme, it's driving ideological fixation rather than actual action or violent action or extreme action to sacrifice yourself on behalf of a group. So the second type is identity fusion, and I'll explain in a second what identity fusion means. But this type is much more strongly associated with violent extremist behavior, for example, with terrorism, where individuals put themselves at risk in order to save their group from a potential threat. And identity fusion is a phenomenon where the personal identity becomes one with the group identity. So you can see here up there in the graphic that a fully fused individual would be in the last depiction, the G, where you see that the self is right in the center of the group's identity. So they have become one. And several studies have shown that when someone is fully fused, they're much more likely to commit an act of martyrdom, or basically an act of extreme violence, even if it puts themselves at risk, if they risk their own life or their life and limb, than someone who's not fused. And Harvey Whitehouse then also integrated different studies that have been conducted on this fusion to violence link into an integrated model, which you can see here. It's a bit small, but I'll explain. Which basically the important thing to keep in mind is that fusion in itself is not enough to lead to violence. So there is another factor that has come out in the integrative model that Harvey put together, which is an existential threat. So that's also why it's called the fusion plus threat model. So in addition to identity fusion, if there's also an existential threat to the in-group, then someone is much more likely to commit an act of violence on behalf of the group to save that group from that threat. And now, in the peer commentary from that came out of this publication, Dying for the Group, which was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2018, there were several additional variables that other scholars suggested might play a role as well in this fusion to violence pathway, which we then also considered in that previous study, so this was the hypothetical pathway to self-sacrificial violence, which would start with identity fusion, but there would be presumed mediating and moderating factors that would come in between on the pathway to self-sacrificial violent extremism, which is of course still the perceived outgroup threat, but also elements of perceived outgroup entitativity and also group violence condoning group norms. I will share in a few moments some of the findings of what we found was actually statistically significant in, for example, the texts of violent extremists. But before I do so, just a note to say that there has been evidence from different cultural and geographic contexts about this fusion to violence link, where studies have shown, for example, that revolutionary battalions in Libya, but also religious fundamentalists in Indonesia, herder farmer groups in Cameroon, and other contexts have shown this strong link between identity fusion and the willingness to resort to extreme forms of violence on behalf of your group. Yeah, and football hooligans, I forgot, in the UK and Brazil. So these were two of the papers that we published based on the research, which looked at, so the first part of the analysis was looking at terrorist manifestos and comparing them to non-violent extremist manifestos as a control group, as well as to just moderate non-extremist manifestos of political writing. And so this was the first part of the research, where we selected manifestos from high-profile attackers of the last 15 years. So it was in the time frame of 2011 and 2021, where, of course, Anders Breivik, the very famous Norwegian terrorist, was kind of the starting point, and then following on from that, a lot of other instances of terrorists who left behind manifestos. Far-right terrorism lends itself to this kind of analysis because, interestingly, leaving behind manifestos before an attack is more of a far-right extremist phenomenon or a far-right terrorist phenomenon than a jihadist phenomenon. So you won't really find any manifestos as such, or not very many. That's not true. It's not true that there are none, but not very many on the jihadist side of the spectrum among the attackers. It's much more common for example, ISIS or Al-Qaeda to then release a press statement claiming responsibility for the attack than for the individual attackers to leave behind a motivational kind of writing or a political text. So these texts were then classified into violent self-sacrificial, non-violent extreme, and non-violent non-extreme or moderate manifestos. And we combined quantitative with qualitative methods, so used both statistical kind of linguistic analysis as well as qualitative text analysis. And before we go into the analysis findings, I just want to say a few words about the narratives that we coded for. This is drawing on mainly terrorism literature. Based on terrorism literature and the different motivating factors that different pieces and different studies have identified, we drew up a list of potential narrative categories and also a list of potential linguistic proxies for these. What you can see up here, so we coded for in-group identification, in-group identity fusion, but also out-group slurs, demonization of an out-group, dehumanization, as well as existential threat narratives, conspiracy myths, and justification of violence, martyrdom narratives, violent role models, as well as hopelessness of alternative solutions. And we then ran an intercoder test, an intercoder reliability test, to make sure that our categories and the linguistic proxies were coherent and could be applied reliably to all texts, and found that there was actually a very high non-expert and expert intercoder reliability of over 90% for most of the narrative categories. And we used 2 expert coders and 24 non-expert coders that we recruited. So we found in this manifesto analysis that yes, indeed, in accordance with the fusion plus threat model, identity fusion featured in 8 out of 9 terrorist manifestos, so was very present, whereas fusion didn't feature in the non-terrorist or non-violent manifestos. And identification, the identification plus threat category, that actually featured across both the violent and the non-violent extremist manifestos. So the distinguishing factors seem to be that identity fusion was much more, or was actually exclusively present in the terrorist manifestos, which strongly supports the fusion plus threat model. And there were also other variables that we could find, but first let me show a few examples, and this is maybe, I think this is okay actually in terms of language, but when I show a slide later, I'll just give you a warning because some of the language that I'll show from the ethnographic research might be offensive or distressing. But here this is mainly about the fusion indicators or linguistic proxies that we could find in the texts of terrorists, so or of perpetrators of violence. So the way that fusion manifests itself in language is often via metaphors of shared blood or kinship. So, for example, people calling each other my sisters or my brothers in an in-group setting. And this is because this is more fully explained in Harvey's behavioral and brain sciences paper, but this is because of the pathway to fusion. That shared kinship is actually one of the key factors, or perceived shared kinship is one of the key factors in that path to fusion. So let me show you a few examples. For example, Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist, had several instances of calling fellow white Europeans his brothers and sisters and referring to them as family, who are exposed to an existential threat. Ernest was another terrorist in the US who also referred to his in-group as my brothers and best dudes out there. Hitler made repeated reference to the German Brotherhood and to German brothers. If you read Mein Kampf, there are a lot of references to this kind of kinship of the in-group. And the same is true for some other terrorists, where, for example, Dylan Roof, a US terrorist, also referred to shared white blood, or to using this metaphor of shared blood with the in-group. So here you can see the manifesto analysis findings on other variables. Actually, there were a few other variables that came out as also playing a role in these terrorist manifestos. And this was basically, the first part of this analysis was qualitative, and the second part was statistical, or was quantitative. I'll show the results in a second. But this showed that, yes, there were identity fusion and existential threat markers that were relevant in the terrorist manifestos, but there were also some other categories, like violence condoning norms, as well as dehumanizing and demonizing language and outgroup slurs. And based on the NLP manifesto analysis, so the quantitative part of the analysis that was done in R, we then found that actually the most statistically significant factors were indeed identity fusion, violence condoning group norms, and justification of violence, demonizing and dehumanizing language, as well as the absence of alternative solutions, or hopelessness of alternative solutions. So these were the most statistically significant factors. And the conclusions from that are, I would say that potentially this could inform new prevention or detection mechanisms used by the security and intelligence community. I actually already gave briefings to some intelligence agencies on this topic, in particular the German Verfassungsschutz, which has now started to rethink their own ways of detecting or distinguishing between the people who online users who might actually pose a real risk of violence from the ones that might just be trolls. And I also briefed YouTube on this, and equally YouTube has also taken steps to think about their own prevention and detection systems and about how to integrate this. So what's interesting is that traditionally, of course, intelligence agencies have assessed risk of violence based on several factors. For example, possession of weapons. But like I showed earlier on the slides, 3D printing and homemade weapons have actually made this assessment less helpful based on weapons, because often you wouldn't you wouldn't find out about someone's weapons possession until it's too late. The same is true for traditional group membership that was very often used as a key indicator belonging to a designated terrorist group, which now with a lot of these developments in terms of post-organizational structures and loose movements and lone actors, that is also becoming a less helpful indicator. And finally, the use of satire and trolling references and this blurring of the lines between trolling and terrorism, that has also made it more difficult for them to find the needle in the haystack and to actually understand what is a real threat of violence. So there are several advantages to the framework that we've been creating, which is that they're not influenced by culture or geographic context or even language. And they're also not, it's also not influenced, or the variables that we're using are not really influenced by whether someone is strategically communicating or is subconsciously communicating. So they can be detected in language, even if there is an effort of so-called shitposting or of using satirical means or gamification. They go onto a deeper level, on a psychological level. A lot of these operate on a very deep psychological level. So the second part of this analysis was then carried out in online extremist groups, violent extremist groups, non-violent extremist groups, and non-extremist groups. So I had different control groups. And we, let me show you one case study that we did for QAnon, which we published in Perspectives on Terrorism in that journal. And here, the key question was, QAnon, for those who are not familiar with it, I think probably most of you will have heard of it, is the conspiracy myth that gained traction first in the US and then now has been spreading also across the UK and Europe, and actually across the world, which initially assumed that, the Democrats were running an underground network of child exploitation or of child trafficking, and has then kind of taken a different shape during the COVID pandemic and was actually recycled and spread, for example, to reinforce anti-vaccine narratives, to also reinforce conspiracy myths about the so-called global elites. And it has really morphed into something that is much bigger and now integrates a whole variety of old and new conspiracy myths, but where it essentially demonizes the so-called global elites, which are, of course, then also very often considered Jewish, where there is this anti-Semitic dimension then that is often added to it. So QAnon, there has been this whole debate about whether they should be seen as a threat to violence, as a national security threat or not. But as of September 2021, there were at least 101 QAnon-related attacks or crimes that were committed by QAnon followers just in the United States alone. And there had been 61 QAnon adherents that were related to the Capitol riots of January the 6th. But nonetheless, there is an academic debate as well as a policy debate about whether QAnon should be classified as something that is potentially threatening to national security or not. So, for example, Amarasingam and Argentino argued that QAnon presents a novel challenge to the security forces and is a domestic terror threat in the making, whereas Maskalenko and Macaulay actually said the opposite. QAnon de-radicalization efforts are a waste of resources and potentially dangerous in exaggerating the QAnon threat. And this was also reflected in policy discussions. Different countries have adopted different ways of dealing with conspiracy myth networks, and in particular with QAnon. So, for example, the German Verfassungsschutz even included a new category, which they called Staatsdelegitimierer, so state or democracy delegitimizers, in order to be able to deal with this emerging threat from conspiracy myth and also sovereign citizen groups. So on the other hand, many governments are still hesitant to include similar categories in their own lists of national security threats. So the research aim here was to understand better to what extent does QAnon pose a challenge or a threat in terms of actually inspiring violence, and also to contribute to this creation of a generalizable toolkit that could be used by security services to assess threat. And we conducted both quantitative and qualitative analysis in first a data set of 200,000 QAnon messages that were gathered from a group called Great Awakening, QAnon Great Awakening. And then we also conducted a complementary qualitative analysis in a range of different QAnon-related groups from different geographies. And what we found here was that, indeed, when situating QAnon in relation to other groups, to our control groups, it was in between. So it was the violence risk based on our framework, based on the indicators that were shown as statistically significant in terrorist manifestos. The violence risk of QAnon was high, but it was not quite as high as in the neo-Nazi terrorist forum Iron March, or I frame it as a terrorist forum. It has been linked to a lot of actual acts of terrorism, and is seen as very high also with the indicators, the risk indicators. Whereas it was much higher than in our control group of a very moderate, non-violent forum, which was Third Hour, which is just a Mormon discussion group. So we wanted something political, but moderate, to have a means of comparing these levels of threat. And when looking deeper into the different QAnon channels, it also became clear that actually there is a difference between different chat groups or different individual QAnon groups, where some might score low on the violence risk and others might score much higher. So there's also a lot of nuance needed. Of course, QAnon has attracted many people across the world, including just some people who might have just been against the vaccines or against the COVID lockdown measures, and some people who went further down the radicalization pathway or the radicalization rabbit hole to even endorsing acts of anti-democratic attacks, for example, against the Capitol or against other democratic institutions, or even attacks against demonized outgroups. And here are some examples of the fusion plus threat indicators that we found in some of the QAnon groups that showed up as potentially high risk for violence. So some of them had a lot of instances of kinship language, which indicates high level of fusion. For example, brothers and sisters, we are in a race against time and a battle against sustained, relentless propaganda. Or look where we are, brothers and sisters, would you have thought that we managed to get here? Similarly, support to our brothers and sisters from the Netherlands. We will not obey this mandatory vaccination and the fascistic COVID pass. And some other ones that I won't read out loud now, but you can see them. And then, and this is where I have to stop for a second, because there will be some derogatory language on the next one and some offensive language. So if you want to look away, or if you want me to not say it out loud, maybe just raise your hand. Or but it's just for illustrative purposes. So there were instances of dehumanizing language, as we would expect, as well as violence condoning norms. So actual announcements or threats of violence against specific individuals or groups or outgroups. And similarly, you can see from the dehumanizing language whether that's describing people as filth or as reptilians or as rats or as dogs. That is deeply dehumanizing in essence. The conclusions and implications from this study were that, yes, indeed, there were, in some of these QAnon groups, there were significant markers of identity fusion and the other indicators on the pathway to self-sacrificial violence. So we should take the threat seriously, although it can't be generalized. It's not the entire QAnon community that can be put under that banner of potentially violence threatening, but it should be taken seriously. The same is true for findings on actual on thinking about new categories to introduce in policy circles, new categories about potential movements that might pose a risk to violence. The question might arise, do we have an outdated definition of terrorism or of violent extremism? And this, of course, shows that QAnon is something that crosses ideological boundaries. It can't really be put in any of the traditional far-right, jihadist, or far-left categories because it is ideologically more fluid, actually. Yeah, and then our research also opens new doors for potential diffusion or potential new intervention programs that might be informed by the underlying psychological factors that seem to be driving commitment to violence. Here are some of the related publications. I also have a book that I'm currently finalizing, which will, however, only be published, I think, in 2025 with Columbia University Press, which is looking at exactly this topic and is using this study, but we also have a couple of journal articles and book chapters based on this previous research project. Here are just some other articles. I'm also happy to share them with you, and you also find a fuller list of the literature in the journal articles. How much time do I have left? I'm just aware. Yeah, perfect, yeah. So the second part of the threat that I would like to talk about, one is of course about violence, but the other one is about how does this potentially impact or influence politics and society. And this is something I wrote up in my last book, Going Mainstream. So the previous book was called Going Dark and was looking at the very darkest fringe corners of violent extremists mobilizing on the internet, potentially leading up to terrorist attacks. And the new book, Going Mainstream, is about how some of these very extreme conspiracy myths and ideas have actually influenced or leaked into politics and mainstream discourse. And the Capitol riots were, for me, personally a turning point in thinking about this emerging phenomenon of where actually studies showed that, there was one study by the University of Chicago that showed that the two key ideological backdrops of the Capitol riots were QAnon and the so-called Great Replacement idea, which I mentioned earlier when talking about the patriotic alternative. And however, we had another study showed that at these Capitol riots of January the 6th, the majority of people who were involved were actually not affiliated with any extremist organization. They were what you would call average US citizens who were, yes, supportive of Trump, yes, they did believe in election fraud narratives, but many of them had no extremist background. So it showed me that there was something happening also to wider society. Of course, this is especially visible in the US, but there have also been similar events, similar attacks against democratic institutions that didn't make it as high up in the headlines as the US Capitol riots did. But there was an attempted storming of the German Reichstag, where very similar symbols, even Trump symbols or Trump slogans were shown in front of the Reichstag. And also escalations in front of the New Zealand Parliament, an invasion of the Congress in Brazil, and other attempts to storm and to attack democratic institutions. There are also other examples of how some of the extremist ideas, which I've been monitoring for the last 10 years, have now made their way into parliaments or into political parties at least, and into the social media sphere, where they're catapulted to a really kind of high level or to a very wide reach by influencers such as Andrew Tate, for example, the misogynist influencer on TikTok, who has also made headlines recently, but he has millions of followers to which he propagates his violent misogynist views. There are also lots of examples from Germany where conspiracy theorists have become so popular that they equally have been sharing their ideas with millions of followers, or at least hundreds of thousands of followers. And of course, far-right populist parties entering governments or winning elections recently, Fratelli d'Italia in Italy and Sweden Democrats are just an example. And other examples that I won't go more in detail now because we have limited time, but we just want to mention because of the very recent headlines that the Alternative for Germany made in Germany, which has prompted protests in Germany, where hundreds of thousands of people were participating in these protests against the far-right populist party because of their ties to the extremist white nationalist generation identity movement. And of course, AfD is right now polling at its highest level. Since it was established 10 years ago, it has actually now reached the highest point in terms of both its radicalism and also its popularity. And this dual development of both radicalism and popularity being so strongly or being at its highest point, that has really made me ask the question, why is that the case? Why can a party that is so obviously tied to extremist ideas and extremist concepts and goals can poll so highly at the same time? And then especially COVID was, of course, an accelerator for a lot of the dynamics, where the United Nations have called the whole range of hate campaigns that took shape in the midst of COVID a tsunami of hate, where anti-minority hatred has become extremely pronounced online, but also offline, shown in anti-Semitic, but also anti-Muslim, in general anti-minority attacks, both online and offline. And also the WHO has coined the term infodemic, or I believe they coined it, they definitely used it, which they said was spreading almost faster than the pandemic itself. So meaning that disinformation has really reached a point where it's been shared so widely that it's really affecting large segments of the populations. This is, of course, looking back at history, this is not new. We've seen that previous crises also inspired an increase in anti-minority hatred and in conspiracy myths. So even looking back at the plague in the 14th century, the conspiracy myth was circulated that, or kind of spread, that Jews had allegedly poisoned the wells. And even during the during cholera, for example, there was also the conspiracy myth that doctors were trying to just harvest organs and had therefore created cholera. So then also the economic crisis, the Great Depression, for example, of 1929 led to a lot of anti-minority resentment, especially against Jews. And security crisis, as we know, 2001, the 9/11 attacks prompted a lot of conspiracy myths. So to sum up, the global polycrisis, as Adam Tooze would call it, this overlapping series of crises that we're facing right now, has created a situation where we're all very prone to conspiracy myths, to disinformation, and also to anti-minority resentment. So this actually brings me, and I think this is coming together really nicely in this current research project that I'm now doing at Calleva, which looks at what actually happens if extremists come into power. And so this project that we're doing now at the Calleva Center, Harvey and me, is taking several research questions, or trying to tackle several research questions. The most important one being, how can we establish a way of anticipating when despotic heads of state or authoritarian heads of state are most likely to resort to extreme forms of violence by looking at the language they use. So we apply some of the linguistic proxies and the predictors that I showed earlier to this, not to non-state actors, but actually to state actors. And a big part of the project will be about refining and testing that framework. So we'll first look at historic heads of state, despotic heads of state, who have used extreme forms of violence, who have committed crimes against humanity, genocides, wars of aggression, and test our framework based on the primary sources that we can find from those leaders. And then we'll move on to contemporary leaders to assess their language and look for these psycholinguistic predictors that are grounded in fusion theory and in some of the previous work that has been done in this space. So so the aim is to further develop this psycholinguistic assessment tool, and to also understand better which despots are potentially the most deadly, and the ones that should be closely monitored by foreign ministries or by the security services and intelligence agencies. And we'll also use a combination of quantitative linguistic analysis and qualitative research. I hope this was informative. Yeah, I forgot to mention, but we're very grateful that the Calleva Center is hosting this and sponsoring this project, and we also have the support of the British Academy with British Academy Talent Development Award and the Erin Eve Trust. So yeah, this project is still at the very beginning, but I'm happy to also talk a little bit about the methods and the design of the study if you have questions related to that already. Thank you. Here are some articles. I mentioned both academic articles and policy reports, and just one slide. I don't want to do too much self-promotion, but these are the books, if you want it in one language or another.
Hi. Yeah, there we go. Thank you very much for this. It's all fascinating, but one question for you methodologically on the language of terrorists. The NLP that you're using to assess the QAnon or far-right groups, have you guys experimented with it on Arabic language script? I know the OCR is sometimes kind of buggy on that, but would it transfer right over, or is that even possible at this point?
It's a good question. It's one of the key challenges we're now also facing with this project will be to ensure that the translations are very accurate and that it is transferable. But what I can say about, in general, the fusion plus threat model has been shown to be applicable to different cultural contexts, also different languages, different geographies. So it seems that it's actually going beyond the more superficial nuances in language, because it really assesses deeper psychological phenomena that should hopefully become apparent in all languages. But it is one of the challenges nonetheless, because of course some cultures might have, for example, more common references to in-group kinship than others. What I did notice in the manifesto analysis, because I was not including jihadist manifests. Well, there are only a few jihadist manifestos, but even in the few online chat groups of jihadists that I had insights into, I could see that kinship language was actually more commonly used among them, and that could also be explained with Aki, for example, being a term that is very widely used in the Muslim community as such, not just among jihadists, but as a way of referring. My brother is a very common thing to say. So we also have to look at different linguistic proxies potentially and expand on those.
Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I mean, my question is somehow related to the last one, I think. You talked about things like identity fusion, etc., facilitated quite a lot by the internet and so on. But there are other areas where there is extreme terrorist violence, say take Boko Haram, for example, or even the Taliban, where they probably don't have the same access to all these things. Are there other drivers which push them to extreme violence like that?
Absolutely. So the previous study just focused on the online world, because of the research question of how the security services should tackle this needle in a haystack problem with all these online threats. But actually I would say the online world and social media is just more of an accelerator rather than a root cause. So of course the dynamics have been mostly found, actually most of the previous studies that were done on the fusion violence link were actually done in offline settings and in remote areas like Cameroon, for example, with the Herder Pharma conflicts, or even some of the other the fundamentalist religious groups where technology didn't necessarily play a big role. I think it is an accelerator, and a lot of studies suggest that it can accelerate some of the radicalization dynamics, or even just becoming part of a group might just be facilitated by new technologies, by social media connecting people. But it's not to say that it's a root cause.
Thank you, that's very thought-provoking. A couple of questions, one quantitative, one qualitative. Quantitatively, what's the size of the association between the identity fusion, and various behavioural markers. And then qualitatively, at individual level, what's the temporal dynamics? How long, over weeks and months, but also daily or weekly within an individual in that state?
You mean how the fusion, the process?
Well, how much might it vary across a week or a day, but also once someone's in that state over months or years? Just interested.
I wouldn't say, I mean, maybe Harvey, correct me if I'm wrong there. Harvey is sitting in the audience, so he can correct me. But I wouldn't say that it's not a very, it's more permanent than that. It wouldn't change within a day or not. If you're fused, because it's such a deeply, it's so deeply tied to your identity, it wouldn't change within a matter of a day or because of one experience. Because very often it's very much rooted in a shared traumatic or shared dysphoric experience with an in-group. So these can be very permanent changes to your identity. And of course the process can, I guess, be gradual. But even just thinking about less malign forms of identity fusion, for example, in college fraternities, there have been studies that showed that tough initiation rituals might also create this fusion effect where the in-group, or it does create a higher level of in-group fusion among the members of the fraternity. And of course, even just thinking about cases of fraternities that can actually really last for quite some time to feel so strongly bonded with an in-group like a fraternity. And the same is true for extremist groups or for some of the darker groups that I was showing in the analysis. This is something that it is hopefully reversible, and this is also where hopefully some of the solutions might lie. How can we actually defuse members? But it's a question of how quickly can that happen. There have been a few initial studies, which again Harvey might be better placed to talk about, these studies of potentially showing the effects of prevention or intervention methods that might use the unshared experience or unshared experiences as a starting point to defuse people.
Sorry, about the size of the association between that variable and various markers, behavioural markers, would be interesting to know. The size of the association. You showed briefly some statistical association.
Mm-hmm.
Just how much of various different behavioural markers does it explain? Just interested in that.
You mean in terms of statistics, in terms of the linguistic analysis in the text? So that is actually a tricky question, because of course a lot of the manifestos had text that was completely unrelated to root causes. Some of the terrorists would have very lengthy details about the weapons they would use in the attacks. So there are two ways of doing the analysis. One would have been to get rid of all this additional content and just analyze the psychological part, or the parts that say something about the psychology. But then it would have been that then potentially you would have actually, it would have not been consistent anymore across the different manifestos. So we decided to take the whole body of text as long as it was authentic and it was authored by the actual attacker, because some of them had copy-pasted elements from other manifestos. But still the fusion percentage was significantly higher in the violent versus the non-violent manifestos, so it has the statistical significance there. But it was not very high if you look at the entire body of for example, Anders Breivik's manifesto, which has 2,000 pages, 2,800. I think after we cleared it of all the plagiarized parts, it was 1,000 pages less, but still it was a very large piece. So identity fusion would of course not feature on every page, or the markers wouldn't feature on every page. So in terms of relative to the entire body of text, it would still be relatively small. But our hypothesis is also once it is present or once there are significant numbers of cases where its presence can be determined, then we would assume that this person is fused.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm quite interested in the prevention side of things, which you haven't talked about much, and it may not be your area of interest. But I'm interested in how we can inoculate our young people from a young age, what kinds of things we might be able to do in schools, where perhaps we might have more influence than what goes on at home.
One of the, I think, most important aspects that also is supported by this research is that I strongly believe that we don't have enough in the education space that focuses on how our identities are changing in online worlds and with new developments, and how potential group dynamics can take off in online forums or in settings that lend themselves to accelerating some of these dynamics. So I think the intersection of digital literacy, which we already talk quite a lot about in school settings, and psychology, where I think the psychological component isn't stressed enough or isn't highlighted enough in that work on digital literacy. How can we perceive ourselves when we enter a group or even a hobby community, once this group becomes political, or once there is, so that people could actually spot signs of strong identity fusion or the portrayal of an external threat, of a demonized outgroup or even a dehumanized outgroup. That's something where I do think there is an awareness raising component that is neglected at the moment. And similarly, and this is of course very early prevention, this is about, as you say, inoculating young people, but also digital migrants, the older generations who basically had the first part of their lives not being influenced by new technologies, also inoculating the older generations, because I don't think it's only a young generational problem, or young generations problem. Some of the research on QAnon, for example, suggests that actually the average age for QAnon proponents is 50 plus. And for some of the other groups that I presented in the research, it's much younger audience, like Patriotic Alternative, for example. But I think it's something where we should look both at school curricula and education initiatives that target the younger generations, but also at the ones that are relevant for older generations. And to some extent, maybe just one more word about this, or one more sentence about this, but to some extent this also relates to despotic heads of state and their rhetoric, because of course, actually as part of the project or an extension of the project, we'll also look at social media interactions with the statements of despotic heads of state who are resorting to violent means, and what this does with the in-group that they portray. And equally here, it's important to raise awareness about how also despotic heads have in the past galvanized entire segments or entire populations into being complicit in their violence. And that is something where I think we need to raise awareness about how to avoid that from happening, to avoid something like the 1930s.
Hi, so thanks so much for the talk. It was really interesting. So you can, I guess you were looking at this sort of fusion with, like, on the within group level, sort of looking at these communities in their own right, but has there been much work to sort of, because it seems like the process of radicalization is often modeled as this pipeline, a sort of progression between communities that are increasingly extreme. Is there a way to kind of map some kind of network structure onto that, and maybe kind of map these quantified traits of things like fusion onto that?
You mean across the entire ecosystem of extremist networks? I think that would be really interesting. Of course, there are lots of overlapping kind of online communities. Also, you could potentially also look at the offline map of extremism, of extremist organizations. I think it would be interesting, but I think that's a huge task. I'm not sure it's feasible. I strongly believe that using different case studies or cases in point to then conduct very targeted analysis is perhaps stronger, and then seeing whether it applies to other cases as well, and whether it can be representative. For example, one thing that I did find in that previous analysis for the DPhil was that actually the fusion violence model did not apply to one group or one community that I analyzed, which was the Incel community, the violent misogynist community. At least based on the manifesto of the Incel terrorist Elliot Rodger, it didn't seem like there was a strong in-group bonding experience, that there was any form of identity fusion that motivated this perpetrator. So there might, of course, also sometimes be other explanations for extreme violence or other pathways. In the case of incels, it might have something to do with more mental health, with potentially some pathologies that might play a bigger role in the radicalization. And in particular, the violent misogynist community of the incels is, of course, a very nihilistic and very lonely community where they don't see themselves as part of an in-group that fights an out-group. They see themselves as them against the rest of humanity, which might actually be something that, or is something that we're also looking into for our new project about the heads of state or the despots, because there might also be a separate pathway that explains extreme forms of violence, which is more based on selfish drivers rather than pro-group drivers. So we're looking at two separate pathways here.
Thank you very much for that. I had a sort of methodological question for you about your second paper, and I was wondering if you, for the QAnon paper, if you counted each message separately or per user, because would the same person expressing sort of identity fusion several times, and if there was one user expressing that a lot of times, change the outcome of the effect size in any way, or how did you go about that?
Yeah. Very good question. We did assess that in the qualitative analysis, and just to make sure that not all the analyzed comments would come from one or just two users in each group. So we double checked that to ensure that it was from a wider range of users. However, I do think that an individual-focused or user-focused analysis would be immensely useful for the future and would be a potentially new angle to look at it, not on a group level, but on a user level. We did also check for bot activity. So for example, we made sure that there wouldn't be any spamming or any bot activity that would falsify our analysis or would, But still, of course, in some cases, there were users that were posting more regularly with using the linguistic proxies that we looked at, suggesting that they might actually be at higher risk of violence than the average in the group. And that might be a more interesting way of approaching potential violence risk detection in the security services. I'm not sure whether it's the right way to go about it in an academic setting, also from a data or from a privacy perspective. I don't know, looking into individual users is of course a very already this type of research is very sensitive, but then looking at individual users is probably even more sensitive than looking at a group level. Super. Thank you.
Just to say thank you very much indeed for being here for the Calleva seminar today given by Julia Ebner. And if you'd like to stay for a drink afterwards, there's some drinks and refreshments in the foyer outside. So thank you.